So thank you, Vice President Worthington, members of the board. Following Indiana's Red for Ed Day, we've had some members of the General Assembly that have indicated that teacher pay was really just a local control issue, that they were inferring that the General Assembly provides sufficient funding to public school districts and it's just not being allocated correctly by our local boards. So for more than a decade, we have tried to shield our schools and teachers from the numerous mandates passed by the state, and we've been pretty successful in doing so. However, because we have shielded our schools from a number of those mandates, many are unaware and therefore may take the statements of some politicians at face value. So tonight, I'd like to share just a few areas where the state has hindered or actually taken away local control. We'll talk about these in 5 buckets: standards, assessments, and accountability, the evaluation requirements, compensation and funding, changing conditions of the community, as well as safety and security. And this is just a small portion. This is not an in-depth review. So let's first talk about standards, assessments, and accountability. We'll just let this sink in for a little bit. Just for some explanation, you have the timeline on the bottom. You have students that have severe cognitive disabilities, had I-STAR, then I-STAR plus IMAS, and then you see the progression as it goes on. Lost links, WIDA and WIDA CCR, all of that's for English as a second language students. The next row up are basically graduation requirements. The next step up is high stakes testing. The next row up would be the different accountability measures and metrics that we've fallen under. And then you see how we have changed standards repeatedly. That anyone can see provides for a very unstable environment. It also creates a lot of additional work that schools never realize, because we don't want them to be impacted by it. So for instance, with now iLearn and with a different vendor, the state chose to go green. So what does that mean? That means the state no longer prints the test manuals for our teachers. So instead of having the schools print those test manuals out, or instead of having teachers scroll through a screen of 60 pages, we print those out and we provide them to our schools. Also, and they're about 60 pages, also in order to go green, the state no longer reports out or prints out the student reports. They expect districts to print those out and to mail them. So we don't expect our schools to do that, we do that. That's about a $25,000 annual cost. There are people that spend the vast majority of their work on these differences. We also have 2 systems of accountability, the state and federal. And when you see the verbiage in blue, who's in charge, is it the General Assembly? Is it the Indiana State Board of Education? Is it the Indiana Department of Education? I don't know, because oftentimes we're in the middle. And I can guarantee you that we're not in charge. But just when you have 2 different grant systems, when you have 2 different timelines, when you have the school improvement plans that are required for schools under the federal accountability model, as well as then different regulations for the state accountability model, it is difficult and confusing at best to keep up. And back in Public Law 221 days, where school improvement plan was pretty benign and not a whole lot of emphasis placed on that, now our school improvement plans mean everything when it comes to federal accountability, federal requirements for grants. So that cascading effect is enormous. And we don't only have 1, but we have 2. Then moving on to the high stakes testing and the technology issues that have resulted from that. And I'm not talking about the 3 different vendors who each had their own different platforms. That's like going from a Windows-based unit to an Apple-based unit. I'm talking about the requirement where all students have to have online testing. We implemented one-to-one devices a number of years ago, and a large rationale, or a large part of the rationale for doing that was an equity issue. We still know of large countywide districts that don't have one-to-one that will bus their elementary students up to the high school labs to take high-stakes assessments. So if you think about kids that come from impoverished backgrounds that probably don't have a computer at home, what's the likelihood of success on what was a timed test when they're going to spend more time just trying to navigate the computer system and less time being able to actually answer the questions that have been asked? We're not talking about the hold harmless provisions. We're not talking about anything else. We're not even talking about the people that it takes to support the technology behind the scenes. We're not talking about coverage or density. We're not talking about any of that. We're just simply talking about the state mandate to have everyone test online and what that takes. And when they say it's local control, I will tell you, they have not provided one penny for school districts to accomplish their mandate. Not one. Changes in graduation requirements. Back when I graduated, of course it was in the previous century, all I had to do was have the number of credits in the right courses and I would graduate. That changed in 2007, where then you not only needed to have the course requirements, but also had to pass high-stakes testing in English and math. Then there were other iterations for the ECA and all that. We've gone back and forth. Now we have grad pathways. So in addition to having the correct number of credits in the appropriate courses, in addition to that, you also have to learn and demonstrate employability skills. In addition to that, you also have to demonstrate post-secondary readiness competencies. So we graduate 1,200 to 1,300 students a year, and each one of those students has to be tracked. Each one of those requirements is individual and unique when it comes to employability skills and how they can demonstrate their readiness for that when it comes to post-secondary readiness competencies. So even beyond the impact that that has for clerical and for tracking responsibilities for our IS system, the personnel that it takes to implement that and to track it is enormous. You could also contend that that's why we now have an opt-in initiative, because part of their responsibilities is to align or work with that. And it's important not only for us, but it's vitally important for students. And students are concerned about that. If a student misses an opportunity as a freshman or sophomore, we don't want that to limit their opportunity to graduate on time. But if you're not careful, then that's what will happen. Evaluation requirements. I think this picture says it all. Not much has changed since 2007, where it took the equivalent of 27 weeks, 40 hours a week, and that's not including lunches or travel or anything like that. But now administrators are required, they're not asked, they are required to spend the equivalent of 225 weeks on the state mandate to evaluate all 1,741 certificated employees. I'm not certain the definition of local control and how that fits into that, but we have no choice in that, and we receive not one single penny for that increased workload.
Because everybody's done every year now.
Everyone is done every year, as opposed to in 2007-8, which is when we went back to track that.
And I've seen the folder of, I mean, it's a lot.
It is massive. And we're just talking about the impact it has on administrators. It's an inordinate amount of work on our teachers also. Is that really where we want our teachers spending their time? I don't think so. That doesn't include the back office support and all of the uploads that are required. When you think about evaluation requirements and now pay for performance, and you have to align STN numbers with the course numbers with the teacher numbers, and we have people that are employed now just to make certain that we are compliant with the state requirements for pay for performance. And while they may say that's local control, not one penny for the additional support staff that we need in order to carry out what the state mandated we do. I think a few things have changed. Compensation and funding, won't talk a whole lot about this because we've covered this. I'm not certain where local control comes in, but when they tell me how I have to pay our teachers, and when the genesis of this was no more than a third could be predicated upon years of experience or education, they've upped that now to 50%. How is that local control? I've mentioned the massive uploads, the data and the payroll systems that had to be aligned, and the cost that it took to align that, and the human capital that it still takes to make certain that those operate efficiently and effectively. All of that has to be tied into the evaluation. And then funding, how that has changed, dollars following the students, the state grants, the audits, to ADMs, the uploads that are required just for the ADM. And then federal grants, Title I oversight. 2009, $49,000 was spent on our private schools, okay? Because it's convenient for the federal government to say, the public school, you're going to be the fiscal agent for the Title I funds, okay? And this is how you shall distribute it. And while, yes, you don't have necessarily the authority over those employees in different buildings in private schools, you are going to have the responsibility for them. So that's jumped from $49,000 to a decade later, nearly $500,000. And if the private school decides to terminate their employment and they file and they're successful, they terminate their employment, the employee then files and is successful for unemployment, EVSC pays that unemployment, even though they've never worked a day in our schools.
And am I correct in understanding that if the non-public schools don't spend their allotment, we don't get that money back?
It comes back and it can be reallocated. There has to be.
Okay, so if they don't spend what they're allotted, it can.
It's really not.
I thought it was reallotted to them next year.
It's not really a simple process.
Okay. So that's the thing. It's
Right.
fall.
And I don't want to be the Title I police, but as you can see, that takes one person's time, 100% of the time, for us to oversee individuals that are not in our school system. Not by our choice. That's not local control. And then congruent on the special ed side, shortfall in funding for special ed because there has been an increase in recognized disabilities. There's been an increase in the multi-cat room as well as the ED classrooms. The state has limited funding, basically in terms of residential placement. Residential placement for high-need kids is in excess of $200,000 a year. So we now have many, many, many more self-contained multi-cat classrooms as well as ED classrooms. We receive actually less funding, as you will see. Our funds, we lost 10% this year, and we were required, because of IEPs and other legal documents, to spend $1 million more due to the needs of our students. I'm not certain where local control comes into this. We spend more than $7 million on special needs students than we receive from state and federal government. And I'm not complaining about special ed kiddos at all. Nobody asked to be born with a disability. We're going to take care of them to the highest extent possible. That's a given. I just simply want the federal and the state government to live up to their responsibilities. When they mandate things, then please provide the funding for those mandates also. Changing community conditions. This is substantiated cases of child abuse and neglect. Nearly doubled in the past 10 years. And while individuals in the General Assembly say that Indiana is among the lowest in terms of teacher ratios in the nation, I would also say in Indiana is 48th in its maltreatment of kids because of general ed policies. Those kids come to us. And I don't know that it makes a teacher's life any easier if there are less supports for those kiddos in school because the state hasn't provided the supports necessary. Children in needs of services in Vanderbilt County has gone up 236% in a decade. Not certain where local control is influenced there. We've also talked about in 2006, we had 268 kiddos that did not speak English at home. English is second language. Now that's tripled to 730 students. And we don't receive funding sufficient to take care of all of the students that we get that do not speak English. Safety and security. This is one that, as we all know, is paramount on our thinking. In 2006, we had one individual that oversaw safety and security. Now we have 9 individuals because of that's the environment that we find ourselves. And I'm sorry that this is so small. We do actually receive a grant of $100,000, but in the red, basically the state requires us to spend our money first before they will give us additional money. So where does that money come from? It comes from the education fund and the operations fund first. And if we're willing to spend that, then they will match that. Not certain where local control comes with that.
Is that $100,000, is that for physical security or employee security?
You can now use that for individuals. There was a point in time where it was facility updates. So even with all those changes, this is what is astounding to me, and I won't spend much time on this because you've seen this before. 2010, we had a couple hundred students that took AP tests. Only 22% of them passed. Now, a decade later, or less than a decade later, we're above the state average with over 1,200 students taking AP tests and scoring a 3 or more. That, to me, is remarkable success that our teachers have achieved with our students. This was also something that was not reported very accurately. When you look at school-by-school comparisons, EVSC had the highest pass rate for a public school in this region. The highest pass rate for a public school in this region. 2 EVSC schools held 2 of the 3 highest pass rates overall. So that's on a school-by-school basis. So let's look at a school corporation. Let's look at peer comparisons. These school districts were selected in 2012 when we were 5th in English language arts and we were 8th in math. It's not like we cherry-picked schools. But in 2012, we picked school corporations that were similarly situated to us in terms of size and demographics. And you can see that we rose in ELA from 5th up to 1st, and then in math from 7th, we dropped to 8th, and then up to number 1. Here's a little bit clearer view of what that looks like. According to peer school corporations, we started out as 5th, and we're now number 1 among peer school districts that are similarly situated to us. You don't see anybody else making that kind of movement. Nowhere else do you see anyone making that kind of movement. You see drops from 2nd down to 5th. You don't see anyone going from 5th or 6th up to number 1. Here's another picture that tells 1,000 words. So despite incredible challenges and mandates, unfunded mandates, and complexities that are sent our way, our teachers have done one heck of a job when the accountability structure has become more difficult. Our teachers are getting the work done. So basically, been tremendous obstacles and changes since 2006. We went back to that date because of MGT of America, but we don't embrace the status quo. We continue to strive each and every day to get better. So when you hear that it's up to school districts, you have plenty of local control, we're providing plenty of funding for you, the reality is dig a little bit deeper, and everything that we have mentioned up there has required extra people to navigate without additional funding. So please, don't buy into the fact that you have plenty of local control. And there were other things that we could have put up on there. For instance, we could have talked about background checks, that have to occur now for all of our employees once every 5 years. That is the equivalent of another 51 hours of work put on someone at over $20,000 a year just to pay for the background checks. And by the way, since we've been doing it, we found nothing. So that's what I have for you in core content. This is about the 170th presentation, I think, that you've had since 2013, that goes beyond just approval of policies or of contracts or the like. But I do value and appreciate the opportunity that we have time to share this information with you. Happy to answer any questions that you may have.